Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 K-State Garden Hour series. Thank you for joining us today. This series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Cassie Homan, and I'm the Horticulture Agent for the Post Rock District. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. So make sure to use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where we'll look for your questions, and we have a moderator that will go through all of those. So that should be a little button down at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator today is Brooke Garcia. She is the Training and Support Specialist for the Department of Entomology. She will be keeping track of all the questions that come in. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. So we typically upload additional resources and great content there for you to go check out. We also have previous topics and upcoming topics from the 2021 series. So I'll go ahead and have our moderator send that over the chat so you can look at that website for more details. Please be sure to like, share, and use the K-State Garden Hour hashtag to help promote this program. This webinar series has allowed us to continue to provide extension education related to horticulture and gardening given the circumstances we are in today. Everyone in our department and involved in the series are extension professionals for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline. But most of all, we love gardening in the natural environment. I personally love that this series has brought gardeners from all over Kansas together to learn. So today's topic is gardening in the shade, and I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Dennis Patton. He is the horticulture agent in Johnson County, and he is an ornamental plant expert, so you're in for a treat. So give us a few minutes to transition and let Dennis share his screen.
Okay, I believe my screen should be up and shared now. It is a pleasure, it is a treat to be with you today on this beautiful spring day. For those of you residing in Kansas, I think most of you woke up to snowfall yesterday that didn't feel like spring. But today we do have at least sunshine back and hopefully spring weather coming. So if you saw the 4 poll questions that were up at the start, that kind of gives you a taste or a preview of some of the things we're going to cover, and hopefully you're going to learn and increase your knowledge today as we go through shade gardening. A lot of people have challenges with gardening in the shade, as we'll talk about, but there's also a lot of opportunities and fun to be had by gardening in the shade. I think everyone knows the pleasure of being out in a shady location on a Kansas July or August day, as opposed to gardening in the full sun. And as I said, if you do have questions, go ahead and put those in the question and answer section, and we'll get to those. Hopefully we'll have time at the end of the session to be delving into your more personal questions about shade gardening. So when we talk about shade gardening, we just really need to, first of all, understand what the shade is. No shade is all not created equal. There's different levels of shade. And I think to me, part of shade gardening really gets back to good gardening practices. And that is just learning to know your site and then learning how to deal with that site. Unfortunately, so many gardeners, and I do the same mistake, we want to buy plants. We love plants. And then we impulse buy, shop, and then we end up carrying that plant around our garden, finding the perfect place to plant it. Sometimes that works, many times it doesn't. I know I'm guilty of it myself. I drag plants around looking for a spot. But I think when it comes to shade and gardening in the shade, we need to understand our site before we really start getting into plants. So this presentation is really going to talk more about understanding that site evaluation part. And then we're going to wrap it up with everyone wants, and that's talking about plants, of course. So as I said, not all shades created equal. So light shade is probably the easiest shade to deal with. That's where you're going to get several hours of sunlight a day. This would be more along the edge of the trees instead of under the trees. This would be more where there's an old mature tree with a high canopy. And then the other thing when it comes to this type of light shade, you got to start thinking about the differences between an afternoon and a morning sun. Those afternoon suns can be really scorching, hot, drying, desiccating, where those morning suns just are less harsh. So what I'm saying when it comes to this light shade is that, even though it's got 3 hours, and you're going to see hours on some of these are not absolute numbers. These are kind of ranges of time because, 3 hours of a hot afternoon sun may only need a couple hours to have light shade. Where that morning sun, you may need a little bit longer a time. And I'm going to wrap that up in a little bit and bring it all back home. But the nice thing about having light shade, everyone thinks of shade, maybe dense shade, but the nice thing about light shade is you pretty much got a wide range of possibilities of plants. And especially if you're reaching some of that afternoon sun, you might be able to push some of those more what we call full sun plants into the location. They just may not flower as much, but you still may have opportunities with them. I'm not advancing for some reason. Okay, and then we move into what I'm going to call partial shade. So partial shade is going to be a little bit less sun. You're still going to get some in there. It could be a couple hours of morning, afternoon sun, or it could be that intermittent throughout the days as the sun moves back and forth over the trees or around the buildings. This could be, just early morning sun. So not all shade has to be created from trees. We normally think of shade coming from trees, but they can also come from the building's walls. Even privacy fences. I know my backyard, I've got a 6-foot privacy fence, and right at the base of that fence, depending on the orientation, is more shady than just out 2 to 3 feet. So a lot of times shade gardens taking advantage of microclimates. And here again, partial shade might be some bright reflective light coming off of a white building or brick or something like that. And if you're in this partial shade, I still think you have a fairly good open palette of plants. It's going to decrease a little bit. You're still going to be able to embrace some flowering plants. But one thing you're going to notice as the amount of shade increases, the amount of flowering plants is going to decrease with us. And then we're getting into what I call full shade. So this is where you maybe only get an hour or so of sun a day, or it may be coming through a dappled tree, like a honey locust that has a very fine textured canopy, and you get dappled sunlight coming throughout the day. Here again, that could be this north face of a wall of a fence. And as I said, the more you get into lower light limits, the more critical your plant choice is going to be. Not just for flowering, but also that plant has enough photosynthesis for it to carry on energy to produce the plant, even to grow. And the other thing that we're kind of coming into play with more of this heavy shade is a lot of times we're back to its tree root competition. And we're going to talk about trees next. But a lot of times when you get into more heavier shade, full shade, it's usually dry shade in Kansas because you have competition for roots. The structure of the tree, that tree acts like an umbrella. And, you may get an inch or 2 rain, but under that tree, it may be a half an inch or quarter an inch because that water kind of drips off to the side. And so as we start moving into these more shady locations, then we really got to start thinking more about, are we going to water? So it gets back into our maintenance of our gardens. Are we going to be more dry? Are we going to supplement the water? Because that then is going to dictate here again our plant choice. So it's all these thoughts behind the scenes before we ever get to selecting a plant. And here again, as we move into more shade, then that's when plant selection becomes more critical. And we're looking at those plants that are going to be more shade tolerant, maybe not partial sun, part shade, those type of things. And then probably the hardest shade for people to deal with is this really what I'm going to call dense shade. This would be, no matter the day, you go out there and it's going to be, kind of cloudy dark, if that makes sense. You might struggle to read a book in really dense shade because you're getting no indirect or no direct sunlight coming in. It's going to be under the canopies of those really dense mature trees, like a maple or an oak tree up close to the trunk. Here again, a lot of neighborhoods where houses are packed close together. It could be from that. It could be overhangs, where you're dealing with not only shade, but lack of moisture. And here again, in Kansas, a lot of times you get into this dense shade. You're talking about very dry areas. The soil, like I said, dark, not in the term of the color of the soil, but dark just because of lack of sunlight. And here again, this shade's going to limit your plant palette the most. And here again, this is where we're going to struggle really to find many flowering plants. So the other thing to keep in mind about plants is that plants really tolerate the shade. Most plants are going to do better with more sun, degreeing levels of sun, that is, though. So they're tolerant. They're not necessarily meaning they're shade loving. A lot of times plants that are thicker leaf, larger in size, color play a part in how they're adapted. So bigger leaves, bigger solar collectors, smaller leaves may be less likely. Sometimes though, really fine leaves are more likely to burn in hot sun versus larger leaves. And so hostas really are shade tolerant as opposed to shade requiring or shade loving. So there's a little bit difference there. We normally think about hostas being shade loving, but really they tolerate the shade. Actually, most of our hostas will grow bigger, have better color if they get more sun. So it may be more to that dappled light shade as opposed to dense shade. So here again, I've already said they're kind of like leaf collectors to have that absorbing the light function. And also keep in mind, gold hostas tend to reflect light, heat up, and they develop here again, as I said, best in a little bit more color, more sunlight. Blue hostas maybe do a little bit better in a shady site. White hostas, really, the problem with white hostas is that they don't have as much chlorophyll. And white hostas are really difficult because they need more sunlight because they have less chlorophyll that drive the plant. But if you get them into too much sun, especially that hot afternoon sun, that white desiccates, it burns very easily. So a lot of times people think, well, I'm going to put a really white hosta in really dense shade. Sometimes that plant struggles because it just doesn't have enough chlorophyll. It doesn't have enough solar collector to drive those plant processes. So sometimes that's a little bit opposite thinking that we might have on some of those plants with variegation. So also keep in mind the tree canopy effect. It's going to change if it's trees. So during the springtime, now, the last month or so, the tree canopy is open. You're getting great sunlight coming in. That's why when you look at a lot of our woodland plants, or what we call ephemerals, they come up early spring, the Mayapples, the bloodroot, those type of things, Martensis, Virginia bluebells. They come up, they get great sun, they can make energy, make photosynthesis to carry on the plant. But then as the canopy comes out, sunlight decreases and those plants go dormant. So that's why a lot of times you see all these beautiful woodland plants early on, but then by summer they've gone away because they take advantage of those open canopies. And you could also maybe work bulbs into your shade because of that same thing. They can have that chance to get the energy before the trees leaf out. Keep in mind, as I kind of already said, most shade plants benefit from brighter light or some direct morning sun for short durations of time. It just, here again, more photosynthesis grows the plant. And like I said, plants tolerating really deep shade are probably gonna do a little bit better in a little more sun situation. Like I said, just more energy, better growth. So as we kind of get into assessing our site a bit more, here again, we want to observe the differencing lengths of the shadows as the seasons change. The sun comes higher in the sky during summer versus spring and fall. Here again, how those leaf patterns, some trees have already leafed out, some are just starting to leaf out. And the other thing to keep in mind is shade patterns are going to change as the plants mature. As those trees get bigger, it's going to be a larger shade pattern. It's going to become more dense, closer to the trunk. So, where you might have been able to grow a plant 5 to 10 years ago under a large shade tree may be different now because the amount of sunlight has increased. Now, you can go in and thin out and prune out the trees periodically to get more sunlight coming in, but there's only so many branches you can prune out of a tree before you start affecting the health, the vigor, the structure of the tree itself. And so, as I'm saying, your garden changes. Just that's true of any garden. As plants mature, you have less plants, things change. So just keep in mind, it's not a one and done. A garden, as you know, is a continual process. Jokingly, gardeners say all our plants have wheels, so we can keep moving them around to the best location. And, things are going to change unexpectedly. I don't know how many times I've gotten calls after a storm's gone through, the tree was broken apart, and now we've got hostas in full sun. What are we going to do? Well, that's your chances to come in there and try something new, to rearrange. and make sure it works. So as I'm saying, gardens always change. And here again, I think it's always important. To me, when it comes to shade gardening, and one of the poll questions was, there was really no right or wrong answer, but in my estimation, really it's water is the driver, because we can find the plants that will tolerate the roots, we can find the plants that will tolerate the shade, but a lot of times water is going to be that limiting factor. Because like I said, usually with tree competition, water is the limiting factor because it shields the water. And then also our tree roots are very competitive for that available water on the plants itself. And so, here again, part of good gardening practices is always going to be note what plants thrive in certain locations. So here again, find those microclimates. If you're out there studying your property, at different times of the day, there may be that little ray of sunshine that comes through an opening between the buildings. There may be that ray of sunshine that comes in, depending on how the branches are, how the trees are placed. And so, take advantage of those microclimates. And then also, just don't look in your yard, because a lot of times these sun shade patterns come from your neighbors. Here in Johnson County, where houses are fairly close together, you may have a neighbor's tree that's casting the shade pattern to your side of your yard. So it may not be your tree, but you're still left with a shade garden. Now, the advantages or disadvantages of that is, take advantage of what your property has. But on the other hand, you have no control of what your neighbor might do with that tree. He may come in or she may come in and choose to prune it heavily. They may come in and choose to remove that tree. But, we got to assess our site, our situation, and take advantage. So just as good gardening practices, we know what we need to do to make sure that we have success when we get in there and start planting our gardens. So what I'm kind of saying is we're going to reassess that site annually as that shade increases, decreases, patterns change. We want to do that to make sure that we do have, make good, wise choices. And if we're adding new trees, one of the fallacies people make is when they plant that tree, they don't think about 10, 20 years down the road. So a good tip is whenever you place a tree, don't think about the tree size of what you're planting today, but lay out or visualize what that tree can look like in maturity at 10, 15, 20 years. Because what tends to happen is a lot of people are gung-ho, they'll plant 2 or 3 trees. And when they're, a 2-inch caliper tree, maybe 10 feet tall, they don't look very big. But 10 years down the road, those trees have grown together. We've got very dense shade. A lot of times people think about putting in shade gardens because we do not have any good grass species that will grow in heavy, dense shade. So one of the alternatives maybe to not growing grass is putting a shade garden in. But if we could kind of think ahead how those trees are going to grow, we might be able to limit or reduce some of those problems with turf growth. And when we get to plant selection a little bit later, we'll touch on ground cover usage, which is not technically a shade garden, because when I think of garden, I think of a collection of plants. When I think of a ground cover, I think of a solo or one plant or something that's covering up an area. And so really, it comes back to it's easier to move those perennials and annuals around than it is to how to deal with trees that are too close together, too tightly spaced. Trees provide so many benefits to our landscape, not only for the shade, but for cooling effect, for pollinators, especially if we're using native type species as opposed to non-native species. Like an oak tree provides food sources for several hundred different insects that our birds and other plants and animals feed on. So here again, we're just kind of thinking through not just today, but tomorrow and the future. So kind of what does all this mean when it talks about assessing your site? This is a really scientific answer, but it's really sometimes trial and error. As gardeners, we love to share success stories and what works. And just because maybe something's worked for your friend in their shade garden, your shade just may be a little bit different. Your soil types may be different. Your amount of moisture may be different. And sometimes it's just really hard to know. And so then we just want to maybe, trial and error. A lot of plant gardeners will say a plant gets 2 or 3 strikes and then they're out of their garden. So that means a lot of people will try the plant 2 or 3 times before they decide whether or not it's something they're meant to grow and have in their garden. So as we move on to the second part of the presentation, then since I'm going to assume that most of us are gardening around trees with shade, because buildings, create a little bit less challenges for us, because then we know it's usually a blockage of moisture from rainfall. That's going to be our challenge, but trees really become the main, I think, backbone or the main provider of the shade for the shade garden itself. So keep in mind that not all trees are created equal when it comes to not only canopy and density, but we're going to talk mostly about the root system here. Some trees have a much more fibrous root system that's going to be very competitive. Some trees have a less fibrous, but more thicker root system, so to speak. And then also some trees do not like you playing around them and disturbing the soil. Oaks, for instance, are extremely sensitive to soil changes. Another plant that hates to have their root system messed around is Japanese maples. If you start continually digging around that fibrous root system of Japanese maple, you're going to stress out that tree and potentially shorten its life. Maples, hackberries, they're known to have very fibrous root systems, but they're more tolerant of changes in the soil. And why I'm talking about the root systems and so important is, we used to think that the trees were a mirror image. The canopy you saw on top is what the root system looked below. But now we're really finding that trees really look more like a wine glass or goblet, because the vast majority of the feeder roots that take care and support that tree are in the upper 6, 8, 10, 12 inches of the soil, exactly where the root system for these plants we're going to be planting are. So they're going to, here again, they're competing for the soil, the nutrients, the water, in addition to the sunlight. And so disturbing, digging around, changing a lot of those root patterns could have some impact on the tree. And like we've already talked about, most shade under trees tends to be dry shade. So another thing to keep in mind is trees don't really tolerate many grade changes. Adding an inch or two of soil over a large portion of a root system can actually cause that tree to decline or die. The best analogy is it's kind of like putting a plastic bag over your head. When you add soil over that shallow root system, it excludes oxygen, air exchange, and those roots carry on respiration. They need oxygen. And if you deplete them, you decline, the tree declines. So you have to be very cautious. Never add really soil under a tree to change the grade or take soil away. It's better if you've got some grade issues, some ruts, those type of things, to level that off with compost or mulch, because it's light, airy, and it gives that ability to have that air, that gas exchange, so those root systems get the oxygen that they need to survive. Another thing to consider is when you're planting the plants, the least you can do to disturb the root system, the better off. So we don't highly recommend, if you're putting in a new shade garden, going in there and rototilling everything, tilling it up like we would for a new garden out in the sun, because we don't want to disturb that much of the root system. Sometimes we recommend putting in smaller plants because you don't have to dig as big a hole. But on the other hand, I would still try, even on a small plant, to dig a hole maybe twice the size of the plant, so you get those fibrous roots away from that plant so it has a chance to adjust and establish before those roots grow back in. Because once you start watering these plants, these fibrous roots of these trees, they're opportunistic. They're going to move in. They're going to start wanting to suck up that water, that nutrient, and use it for themselves. And here again, if you need to level the soil, fill back in, it's better to use compost, something lighter, airier than a heavier, clay-based soil that we have here in Kansas. And it goes without saying that we want to be careful when planting not to cut or damage a lot of root systems. If we cut or damage roots, especially the larger, an inch, 2 or larger, those are like a network highway. I sometimes compare a tree root system to an interstate highway system. You think about in Kansas, I-35 or I-70, and how many streets and how many roads connect to I-70 or I-35. But then you kind of get down into your neighborhoods with the main thoroughfares and how many those connect. And then you get down into the cul-de-sacs, where there's just a few houses on that street. And to me, that's how a tree system works. So the more you cut up that chain, the more you cut on those I-35 and I-70, the more you sever all the connectivity down to all those cul-de-sacs. So what we're trying to do is really only disturb those cul-de-sac, those small neighborhood roots, those fibrous roots. We don't really want to cut into those large root systems because how much they feed the tree and how they anchor the tree. Also, if we start watering around a tree a lot, we can get rot and decay coming into the wood itself. So those fibrous root systems, they regenerate fairly quickly. And like I said, they're going to search out your water. And here again, a lot of times, if you don't want to put a shade garden in, you don't have good soil, it's all fibrous, roots, add that 2 to 3 inches of mulch. Some people even will plant in mulch or compost. Now here again, you have to really keep up on your watering, but here again, that does not harm the tree. And it goes without saying, we never pile dirt, soil up around the trunk of the tree. And for that matter, we don't even put mulch rings up against the tree. We want to do what we call no volcano mulching. We want to keep that moisture away from the trunk. So keep that out 3-4 inches from the base of the tree with your mulch you're planting. And I'd even recommend planting several feet out from the base of the tree so we don't deal and damage as many roots. So that's kind of dealing with how to get the garden established. So let's kind of move now to some design tips for shade gardening. And so as we've already kind of learned, it's not as much about flowers, it's more about foliage, texture, form of the plants that create the interest. So in a shade garden, we want varying shades of green. Not all greens created equal. Here again, that's going to give you more interest. We want more variegated foliage because here again, that variegation tends to show more. One of the poll questions is yellow and white foliage. They tend to pop out. They lighten an area. So if you have a shady area, you may want to gravitate more to some of the golden shade, chartreuse shade hostas. As opposed to dark greens or blues, they kind of recede. It's kind of like the warm color, cool color, color wheel, when we design with flowers, kind of the same things. Those warmer colors, the yellows, the whites. I know white's not a warm color, it's technically not a color, but still, those colors tend to pop. Blues tend to get lost. Now, if you're going to be strolling through the garden, you might want to put some bluish plants and things in there just to create interest. But if you're trying to view this garden from the kitchen or the porch, bold, strong colors, textures, and of course, just resign yourself to it's not going to be a show place for a lot of flowers as you move into heavier shades. So just embrace foliage. Foliage is there day after day. Flowers come and go. So shade garden's not for everyone. So here's kind of a few tips for maybe how to beat the competition. Here again, some of the red maples, silver maples, they have so many strong fibrous root systems. River birch is another tree that's notorious for having so many fibrous roots. Instead of creating a garden in the shade, why not just maybe use some containers? Spot 3 or 4 containers under there, mulch, just put a mulch ring under the tree to cover up the root system, to stop soil erosion, those type of things. And then just pop a few containers in there with some color. Or create, what I call a vignette, put a bench, a seating area out there and kind of create what we call a garden room to embrace your shade. So shade gardening doesn't have to be this wall-to-wall hosta and other plants. It can be varying degrees. So here again, some containers, a bench, some seating area, it's some statuary. So what we're doing is creating some focal points, something that kind of covers up what most people perceive as more of an eyesore, where grass can't be grown under those trees, but yet you may not really totally embrace this concept of shade gardening. And it also depends, shade gardening is going to be more labor intense because the water requirement needs itself. And keep in mind, when it comes to grass and not being able to grow grass under trees, mulch is your friend, as well as ground covers. So as far as maintaining the garden, in my estimation, water becomes key. We can find plants that are adaptable, but it's harder to find plants that are shade loving and are really drought tolerant. So to me, we got to start with how much water are you going to be willing to water? 1 to 2 inches. I'm going to say under heavy shade in the heat of summer, we're probably looking closer to that 2 inches of water per week because of the competition with the trees. And here again, we always water deeply and thoroughly. We're going to want to mulch our shade garden, here again to hold the soil. Fertilization, this is extension. We always say start with a soil test. And my take is I think we tend to over fertilize a lot of our perennial gardens. So it may not be necessary. Keep in mind that fertilization does not make a sick plant healthy. Fertilization helps a good plant grow stronger and more vigorous. But if the plant's not thriving because of lack of water, lack of sunlight, fertilizing it's not going to help it grow any better. So a lot of times people think fertilizer just is a salvation to all plant problems. No, they're a tool for making plants stronger, but the plant has to be healthy and vigorous in the first place. So through all that, we're now going to get to the point that probably most gardeners really wanted me to spend the whole hour talking about, and that are plants for shade, because gardeners love nothing more than plant lists. And I believe the moderator, the host, are going to post several links in the chat box of some resources that Johnson County Extension has that are the plant list for shade, for perennial plants and dealing with shade. So if you're looking for those plant lists, I would recommend, hopefully they're posting those in the chat, that you copy and paste those, and you can look at those a little bit later or come back and view this session. So we're going to kind of talk through various sections of plants. So first, we're going to kind of start with the understory trees. And keep in mind, if they're native, I put an in there beside them as we go through. And so redbud, here again, redbuds right now in the state of Kansas are absolutely gorgeous. Keep in mind, redbuds are not found in dense shade. Redbuds are found at the edge of the woodlands. And that's kind of true for the flowering dogwood and the Coosa dogwood, and then serviceberry. I don't have pictures of every tree on here, but all these understory trees are probably going to be in the 10 to 15 foot range. So this might be a tree you put under, or a small tree you put under that large mature oak tree or that large mature maple tree. You move it out to the edge to create layers. As we know, gardening's all about creating layers of plants. And that's how I've kind of tried to showcase these plants on how we create the layers from the tallest. And then I'm going to go from the border kind of to the back of the bed itself. So here's some small trees that will tolerate varying amounts of shade. And we do have some shrubs that will also tolerate some shade. Some of our viburnums will tolerate light to medium shade, such as the arrowwood, brookwood, the Korean spice that's now in flower. Witch hazel is a fun little understory shrub. Some people call it a tree. It bloomed back in March, about a month ago. Japanese Carya is the yellow flowering shrub. It's probably one of the best flowering shrubs for really dense to heavy shade. It's kind of a unkempt looking plant. It kind of tends to colonize, but it has those bright yellow flowers. And then it has this nice chartreuse green stems and foliage that pops during the season. And even our oak leaf hydrangea, it ideally would take some afternoon shade. So here again, it can go in that light kind of shade category. And here again, with these flowering plants, give them a try. If they don't work, you can always move them out to a little more fun, more full sun plant or location. Other plants you might want to look at, New Jersey tea, one of our natives, red twig dogwood for the red foliage, red stems during the winter months. St. John wort will take some light shade. The smooth hydrangea, that's what's pictured here. Most people probably know smooth hydrangea as Annabelle hydrangea. But the problem with putting Annabelle into shade is it tends to flop a little bit more, but you still get those big white showy flowers in some light shade. Itea, Sweet Spire is another one. Here again, some purple, red fall colors. And then Winterberry holly is one of our deciduous hollies that also will do fine in some shade, and as will the evergreen holly will do okay in some light shade. And so rolling into that, here's a few evergreens for some shade. As I said already, holly. Our boxwoods will not tolerate really dense shade, but they'll go into pretty heavy shade. They're going to get thinner, sparser, but they're still going to tolerate it. Oregon grape holly has the yellow flowers. That's the picture on the top I borrowed from Monrovia. And of course, azaleas, rhododendrons, yews, surprisingly, will take a little bit more shade. Actually yews don't like really hot, sunny locations. They really tend to gravitate more to some shade. And then the leatherleaf viburnum is another one that you can see as a large 10+ foot shrub that will take some fairly good amount of shade and still give you some nice flowers. It's what we call a semi-evergreen. And then we look at some grasses for the shady areas, the bottlebrush grass, the hukanoya grass, Japanese forest grass, and then sedges. The last few years with the move to natives, we're seeing more and more sedges on the market. And they, a lot of times they look kind of like the liriope. So, here again, we have Pennsylvania, oak, wood, Texas. Those are all considered native sedges. And then I call the non-native ones carex, which is a scientific name for sedges. But I really love these Everlow, Evergold sedges that are on the market now, especially the yellow one, because it just pops. It really shows up that color more so than some of the variegated liriope. And then juncus will also tolerate some light shade too. And then as we move kind of more into ground covers, ground covers are, my thought, are more just one single plant filling an area. We have quite a few. Ajuga, to me, that one works better in small areas. Vinca minor, probably statewide, is the best ground cover for our state. English ivy is a good ground cover. It is an invasive in some parts of the country. Pachysandra, it's a little finicky. It likes a little bit more acid-loving soils, but it can work for us. Lily of the Valley, starting to flower now, is a fairly dense ground cover. The spreading liriope, a lot of people hate that plant, but it can work for you. Right plant, right place. The hardy plumbago, which is the purplish blue flower plant there, works nice. And then sweet woodruff. I've got that in my own garden. It took 3 or 4 years for it to really kind of take off, but now it's establishing and it has these really pretty white flowers here in the spring. So here are some kind of ground covers. Probably the best, like I said, best ground cover, especially if you got some pets or a little bit of traffic, is probably Vinca minor, but keep in mind, none of these will take a lot of heavy foot traffic. You might want to establish a path or something like that through them if you're, want to walk or you got a dog that's going to run, those type of things. So some border low-growing perennials that we might want to look at. Arometallica, which is the first picture variegated there, that is an ephemeral. It will put on a seed head with some really bright orange fruit. It can reseed, but it's a nice early spring color. Virginia, pig squeak, is a nice bright green leaf. The Brunaria, Jack Frost, a few others, is a little light blue picture down below. Nice little clumping plant. Epimedium, I love epimediums. They're really small, low-growing plants with some very dainty blooms. Some of our hardy geraniums, the hellebores, the Linton rose, the picture there in the lower right, provides a lot of nice early color and leaf growth. Some other border perennials, of course, coral bells, heuchera, the lady's mantle there, the upper left picture, Pulmonaria, the lower left, Tiarella there in the upper right. I've got a clump of Tiarella in my shade garden. It looks just like that picture now. Actually, that is from my garden. The Virginia bluebells, and then the wild ginger, the Canada ginger, is a really nice shade-loving ground cover, early or border perennial forest. We kind of move to kind of the middle of the bed. We get into some of our larger plants, couple foot high. A stilby. That to me is one of the biggest water hog plants there are out there. I cannot grow it because I do not water enough, but some of the anemones come in pink or white. Bleeding heart is a great one. Everyone knows the old fashioned, but the lower right is one of the fern leaf ones that tend to stay more evergreen during the season as opposed to go away like the old fashioned. And then of course, columbines, the hybrids, are the canadensis, the native ones. And then a plant I've really fallen in love with lately is the lobelia, the blue one, which is that lower left picture, is one of our native plants, much more durable than the red one, the cardinal flower that most people are familiar with. Some other plants are the old-fashioned ladybells. Of course, everyone knows about hostas, Solomon seal, especially the variegated one there in the lower left. That white kind of jumps out. It forms a nice thicket. That's in one of our demonstration gardens here in Olathe. And then the toad lily. I love toad lilies because they bloom in September, October. And so when you think the season's over, boom, out pops the Tricertus, the toad lily. And don't overlook ferns. Now, the problem with ferns is most of them are going to require moist soils. Most people are familiar with the ostrich fern, which is the lower right, or the Japanese painted fern, which is the lower left. But there's also lady fern, Christmas fern that do great in parts of Kansas. But here again, the ferns are going to need a little bit more water to stay healthy and happy. And lastly, kind of wrap it up before we go into Q&A, are annuals. Annuals are going to hopefully provide that pop of color. Begonias, the Browalia, coleus. Keep in mind, when I started in horticulture as a kid, coleus were just shade-loving plants. And then the breeders brought in these sun coleus now, which dominate the market. They will tolerate some light shade, but the problem with those sun coleus in shade is they just don't grow as robust, and they don't develop as intense colors as they do into more sun. Impatiens, the old Wallerina types, some parts of the state have issues with downy mildew, but it's still, if you don't have problems, probably still one of the best plants. Now on the market, there are the Sun Patient series, which have been crossbred to hopefully get away from the downy mildew. The problem with the Sun Patients, they usually come as individual plants for like $4 or $5, $6 a plant. And it's very hard to mass unless you've got quite the budget with them. Lobelia, of course, pansies are great for spring and fall. They won't tolerate the heat of summer. And Perennia are some of our other great, more shade-loving annuals. Lastly, before I open it up to Q&A, hey, I'm the speaker, so I'm going to do a shameless plug. Our Johnson County Extension Master Gardeners are having their garden tour. Is canceled in 2020 because of COVID. But on May 21st, 22nd, we have 5 gardens owned by our master gardeners here in Johnson County on tour. Tickets are available online at our website. If you're in the area, you can also buy them at local outlets. So if you're up in our area, you want to get away, enjoy a day of outdoor gardening, please come to our garden tour and visit our 5 gardens on our garden tour. And with that, I'm going to stop the share and we can open it up. We have about 15-20 minutes, open it up for questions.
All right, thank you, Dennis. That was a great presentation. I loved seeing all the pictures of the plants and getting ideas for my landscape this summer. So we do have a lot of questions. So Brooke will lead the Q&A and we will go up until 1 p.m.
Okay.
All right, are you ready, Dennis?
I'm ready.
Okay. First question, is there a good perennial ground cover that grows in cold and windy, shady areas?
Cold, I'm not worried about cold so much, or windy either. I would probably go back to Vinca Minor. I think for most Kansas, that's going to be our best one. There's also one called Vinca Major that's a little bit bigger stature, a little bit more coarse textured. And if you're not opposed to English ivy will also work too. And the problem with English ivy, it becomes invasive when it goes upright and starts to flower. As long as it's going straight across the ground, it never matures enough to flower where it's going to reseed. So I think those would be my 2 go-to, especially for larger areas. Those other ones I mentioned, I see those as small kind of niche patches instead of filling a large area.
Perfect. And I know we had a lot of questions just in regard to that recent freeze and especially the snow and hostas and kind of what to expect going forward, if you wanted to touch on that.
Well, I can only speak for what's happened here in the Kansas City area. And so far, we have dodged a bullet on the last 2 nights. Last night, we were supposed to go to 28. We only got to like 32, 33. And when I've surveyed my garden this morning and others, so far, everything seems to be A-okay. I think we've got one more night of cold tonight. And I know Southwest Kansas got a little bit colder. If the hostas, if plants were damaged by a freeze, my advice is do not remove the damaged tissue until you know what's alive or dead. And the theory behind this is some green, even though it may not look the best, is better than no green. So my advice is just let the plant I know it's hard, just set back, wait, let the plant show you where it's going to regrow, come back from, and then prune out or remove the brown leaves. But if hostas have been nipped, don't cut off the entire leaf. If it's half green, half brown, half green is better than no green. And when it comes to the peonies, yeah, the most concern would be for the flower buds. I think the foliage will be fine. They'll recover. Now, unfortunately, the foliage was damaged too. That's, the peony only puts on one flush of growth a year and that's it. And so unfortunately, if they got really hammered, it's probably going to affect the blooming next year. But here again, don't cut off, tolerate imperfection, because that's where I've seen people make the biggest mistake after a freeze or a hailstorm is they got to go tidy up the garden, get rid of all the damaged foliage. But like I said, no matter the plant, some green to make photosynthesis better than you cutting it off.
Awesome. So this is another kind of hosta related question someone had asked. I know some hosta lovers who create a soil filled bag constructed from treated burlap used by tree nurseries to reduce some of the tree root competition. Do you have any comments in regards to that technique?
Yes, I've heard a lot of people doing that, but here's my comment. Tree roots can get into a hairline crack. And so those landscape fabric bags are extremely porous. And so when you plant that landscape fabric bag, you may have this idea that you're keeping out those tree roots, but no, they're going to invade as you start watering. And to me, if you start planting those fabric bags in your garden, they're going to become kind of problematic as you want to rearrange the garden and dig around in them. So no, I'm not a big fan of putting landscape fabric bags in the ground. If you want to grow in them on top of the ground, that's all the rage now in the vegetable world, are these landscape fabric bags. But that's not going to keep tree roots. I mean, a tree root can get through a hairline crack in your sewer line. It's not going to be stopped by a little, pinhead size hole in a landscape fabric bag. So yeah, no, I can't recommend
good example there. What about moneywort for ground cover?
Moneywort. I'm not for sure what plant that is with that common name. I'm drawing a blank.
That lime green, like.
Oh, Lysomachia. I knew I was going to forget plants. Yes, Lysomachia. Yes, usually people plant, creeping, something they call it, creeping Jenny. That's the other common name. That's a great ground cover. In my garden, it becomes almost too aggressive. And it takes over, but no, that would be another good ground cover. I think here again, I don't see that, filling up a 10 by 10 area, but in niches in your garden, in little cracks and crevices, and here again, that yellow color just really pops. So yes, I forgot that one. So add that one to the plant list.
Yeah. And moneywort, I will say, like if it has like any harsh sun at all, so even if it's like shady in the morning, it will burn up. Like it does not do great in sunny conditions. Right. So even if you're like, oh, it's part shade, like just be mindful if it's really.
And there is a green version of it too. You don't see it on the market because it's not as ornamental. And occasionally the yellow will revert, and it will tolerate more sun than the chartreuse one will.
Interesting. Okay. So any suggestions on how to keep squirrels and rabbits out of the shade garden, because they're running up and down trees and we know how that goes.
Yeah, so rabbits are my biggest problem, more so than squirrels. Squirrels just kind of tend to dig around and cause some side damage from that. Rabbits are just vicious. I think my option would be either individual cages around the plants as they're coming up in the spring to protect them like hostas. You could use the repellents also, but you have to be very persistent and keep reapplying them. And the best advice is to do it early before the damage starts. You kind of train the rabbit to stay away or the squirrel, but individual cages, that's what I use in a lot of mine. And then once they get bigger, they tend to leave them alone. So it tends to be more, with the rabbits, it tends to be more of an early spring problem than it does a summer problem. Just got to get them past that hump.
Perfect.
Trap them.
If you wanted to touch on walnut trees again and just kind of the challenges with that. And then also we had a couple questions that were answered, but regarding elm trees.
Yeah, so I debated whether or not to put a slide in here about walnut trees because of the juglones issue and the toxicity. There are a number of different handouts. If you search, juglone resistant plants, you're going to get a whole bunch of plant lists from a lot of different universities. Our Johnson County website has one under our fact sheet list. But the problem with juglones is it's all observation, and some people may get by with that plant, others may not. So to me, when it comes to juglones, research that list, and it's going to be trial and error. with gardening under the shade. There are some plants, but your plant palette is limited and there's really no way around it. You can't bring in soil, you can't put them in bags, you put containers above the ground I talked about as an option, but it's just a challenge you got to learn to deal with.
Perfect. Okay, let's see. Kind of scrolling through. Can you talk about, I know we didn't touch too much, but different like vegetables or herbs that could be incorporated into shade gardens?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, this talk could have taken so many different angles. So when it comes to vegetables, my comment when it comes to shade, the higher functioning the vegetable, the more sun it's going to require. So a tomato in the shade, no. But a lot of the spring crops like lettuce, spinach, radishes, onions, those type of things, will a lot of times do fine because, especially if it's tree shade, they're pretty well mature before the trees fully leaf out. So the leafy crops are going to tolerate a little bit more of that lighter shade. Fruiting crop, tomatoes, peppers, which we all love, no, they need 6 hours or more of sun a day. Herbs, herbs will tolerate some shade, but most of the herbs we use we harvest the vegetation, the shoots, the leaves. So keep in mind, if you put an herb in a little more shady location, it's not going to grow as vigorously. You're not going to have that really maybe as thick and full and leafy of an herb to harvest. So it may be a little more, I don't know, wimpy, wispy like. But the other thing I would say is try it. Here again, I do a lot of my herbs in pots. And so you could try your herbs in a pot. If it doesn't work, move it back out and just kind of experiment. And to me, I think, as I said before, I think that sometimes a lot of shade gardening is just experimenting with what works in your situation.
Yeah. And then what about like thinking about containers on patios that have covers? Like what are some good common, plants to throw in containers that are on a covered patio or deck?
Right. So container gardening in the shade, I would look at the same plant list I gave you. If I was going to be in the shade in a container, I would start looking a lot more tropical plants, plants that we think about as being house plants, as being shade plants outside. Some of the ferns, I love Kimberly Queen fern. That's one of my favorite plants. It'll take some sun. It'll take some shade. Philodendron, pothos, crotons, sansevieria, caladiums. There's a number of different plants that really can go. And actually in my own porch on a shady location, the last 2 or 3 years, I've done nothing but house plant foliage plants in my containers on that list. I've even thrown a few coral bells in there too for some color and they do great in there.
Yeah, I've seen those in containers. I think it's really nice.
One of my favorite heuchera is Southern Comfort. It's a very vivid amber, purplish red. This time of year, it's almost a fluorescent orange color as it's coming out. And I've had those in containers for probably 10 years and I have to keep dividing them. So that Southern Comfort was the variety.
Awesome. Okay. So will lily of the valley tolerate partial east sun?
Yeah, I think lily of the valley will. What I think will happen with some of these plants that are shade tolerant is when you get them in a little more sun, you may see some burning of the foliage during the heat of the summer. So you could try increasing your moisture level. Lily of the valley is pretty drought tolerant, but increased moisture sometimes makes up for increased sun level, or just tolerate. If it looks great till we get into late July or August, and then it gets a little ratty looking, chalk it up to Kansas and enjoy the plant. But at least you've enjoyed the flowers for the rest of the season.
Perfect. And then someone had asked like how to amend clay soil. And I know we had another question just about like planting in areas with like really dense tree roots, like how to combat that. So I don't know if you could kind of tag team with those questions a little bit.
Yeah, someone just popped up. Is lily of the valley toxic? So real quick, yes, it is. So you have to be careful around kids. Back to the clay soils. That's to me growing. I had a river birch and I stopped gardening under river birch because it was just layer and layer of fibrous roots and there was no way to get through those roots. So I actually ended up removing the river birch. It was actually the best decision I ever made for my landscape, but that's a whole nother story. So my advice is back to smaller plants. And if it's fibrous roots, get you a sharpshooter spade with a really sharp edge on it, an axe, and just start chopping out those areas around those fibrous roots. get your plant back in there as quickly as possible. I said earlier, use a smaller plant. You may want to go a little bit larger plant that's going to have a more substantial root system on it, in that case, around those fibrous roots. And so they have a chance to get established that first season or two before the roots move back in. And it's getting them established, which is the challenge. Once established, they'll do quite nicely.
Perfect. And then if you want to go over just some deer resistant plants.
To me, there's only one truly deer resistant plant, and that's daffodil foliage, because it's poisonous. But deer it's going to really be based on how hungry they are. So to start giving you a list of deer resistant plants, here again, there's some handouts there from other extension services. I'm not for sure if I can tell you one surefire deer resistant plant. In our demonstration garden here, they eat coral bells. Who would ever thought they would eat coral bells? But they eat coral bells. So it's just really, here again, trial and error. Here again, I'd go back to the repellents early on. If they're a particular plant they really want to go after, I'd do some chicken wire cages, those type of things. Or if the deer pressure is really, really high, I would put some sort of fencing around the garden. There's some netting, deer net fences that work really nice from the house. You wouldn't even know they're there, but it does kind of change your mindset on how to garden, how to coexist with the wildlife.
Okay, I pulled this question. I think this is interesting, but when you think about all the acorn coverage, that will fall to the ground, like what are some the negative implications of that, or will they cause any problems to the shade plants?
The biggest problem with acorns to me are if they're so dense and they start covering up some of the really low, small growing ground covers where they shade them out. The other problem is germination of tree seedlings in your shade garden, which if you catch them early, they're easy to pull out. Most people are concerned with the acorns and the leaves that they're going to acidify the soil and make it not a hospitable place for plants to grow. And it's going to take decades and decades of acorns and oak leaves decomposing in that soil, really to acidify our soil. Keep in mind that most Kansas soils tend to be high in pH anyway, and we want them lowered anyway. So no, to me, acorns are not a problem unless they're just so physically heavy that they shade out the plants, or it's hard to walk on. And in that case, then I'd worry about it. As far as leaf litter goes, you can leave some leaf litter in your garden. You just don't want them suffocating out the plant. Just push them off to the side.
Awesome. Let me see how much time we have okay, so probably just one or two more questions. What do you recommend planting under cedar trees, or is that kind of just similar to the presentation today?
Yeah, under cedar trees is extremely difficult. And it's not because the cedars made them acidic. It's just that there's no water that gets through that dense canopy. And it's such dry shade. My take is don't lift the cedar, leave them as low to the ground as possible. If they're an old, more mature tree with a high canopy, then I think you could go in and do some shade gardening. But if it's just a couple foot off the ground, like some cedars, my advice is just a mulch ring. And don't garden under it because it is extremely difficult. And to me, the best thing you do around your trees where it's just maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 feet where it can't grow grass is just mulch it. I think putting a shade guard in those smaller areas, you're working so close to the trunk, you're going to be damaging so many roots, it is more bother than it is benefit.
Perfect. And let's try to get one more question. So let's say, you had a shade garden established, and I know you said you removed your river birch. Someone else said they did too. And then another person had said they're about to take out a 30-foot evergreen tree. So what do you do now? Like what comes next? What do you need to do to the ground before planting flowers or?
So when you remove a tree, really, you don't really need to do much of anything. If you're putting in a garden, you probably want to go in and till the soil, dig it up, maybe add some organic matter, compost to help kind of break up that years of compaction just naturally that occurs under the tree itself. But there's nothing than any of the trees that really prevent something else from growing there once the tree is removed. Some people think, well, I removed the tree, nothing will grow there. It really just has to do with the soil just needs a chance to kind of be refreshened so that it can be grown back in that area. The problem is you lose the tree and you got it all full of hostas. Then what do? Well, you either, kind of live with it, you move the hostas, plant another tree as quickly as possible. And here again, that's just the yings and yangs of gardening. You just sometimes got to, as the word of 2020 is, sometimes you just got to pivot.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for an excellent Q&A session. I will pass it back to Cassie to close us out for today's K-State Garden Hour.
Awesome. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us for K-State Garden Hour, hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We were so glad that you were here today to learn about gardening in the shade. We have lots of other fun topics coming up and past topics that are all available on our K-State Garden Hour website. So we'll put the link in the chat for that again. And this session was recorded and we will post it right on that website as well. So make sure if you missed a few things, go back and look at that. Once you close out of the Zoom, a feedback survey will pop up and we would really appreciate hearing your feedback. It really helps us to continue our horticulture programming. So if you have any questions that didn't get answered today, we have a shared email account that we all kind of help with. That is ksuemg@ksu.edu. So go ahead and send any questions to that. And thanks again for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of the week.